Every medium has its own advantages and disadvantages, so I'm going to share with you today the main pros and cons of using colored pencils. Colored pencils are a relatively new medium. Productions of colored pencils for art purposes started in the early 20th century. Before, they were pretty much being used just for marking and checking. The first production of colored pencils happened on the 19th century, so they're pretty much a new medium. And as said, from the 20th century, they began to be used for art purposes. So there are tons of things that we still need to discover when it comes to this medium. So if you're one of those people who is willing to experiment with colored pencils, you definitely need to know the ups and downs when it comes to this medium. Alright, so let's talk about the pros first, just so we don't start with bad things straight away. So the first main thing that I personally adore when it comes to colored pencils is how precise they are. If you like your drawings to be clean, precise, and as accurate as possible, this medium is just perfect for that. If you sharpen your pencils enough, the amount of preciseness is insane, especially with oil-based colored pencils. Another thing is clean environment. Sure, you have some kind of mess if you decide to draw one piece like with 200 colored pencils, and then you will have 200 colored pencils around you, and this can be messy. But if not, for this medium, all you need is pretty much the colored pencils itself, one paper, and a sharpener. I personally love the fact, as even though I'm an artist, I love the fact that this medium doesn't belong to very messy ones. The one thing I personally discovered I love the most while working with colored pencils is the fact that it brings you back to our childhood. I remember drawing on the floor with colored pencils in bed before sleeping. I kept bringing my colored pencils everywhere with me. And just that innocent vibe you're getting from this medium is something that I truly, truly adore. Picasso once said, every child is an artist. The problem is how to remain an artist once he grows up. So I find this medium to be one of the ways to remain an artist once we grow up. At least it's more than helpful to try, as we are all use this medium as kids. So this connection between these two time frames, when we were kids and now as adults, is something that colored pencils can definitely help us out. Another awesome thing when it comes to this medium is that you don't have the drying time. Comparing to oils, acrylics, and watercolors, where you actually have to wait for them to get dried and layer more layers on top of it, you don't have this with colored pencils. You don't have to wait and risk if your inspiration is going to disappear and that you're going to get out of your art mode. You can work with them as long as you feel inspired and motivated to work with without stopping. Even though a whole set of colored pencils, the big ones, are a couple of hundreds of dollars or euros, it seems like a quite big investment, but once you compare it with different mediums such as oil or acrylics, on a long term they are money savers, as once you get them, they're going to last you for a very long time, as they don't spend that easily. So for example, one investment can last you for over a year, if not even more, depends how often you use them. And even if you spend certain colors faster, almost every brand has an option of getting them in singles, meaning that you can get them one by one depending what you need. And they're all just a couple of dollars. So again, you're saving money in this way. One thing that is also amazing with this medium is their way of layering and blending. Sure, this is something you can do with pretty much any medium, but just the way how you can do this with colored pencils is so different. The feeling is different, the process is different. Seeing colored pencils that seems quite usual at one point being able to do miracles on paper, seeing the process of combining the 2, 3, 5 colors on the same place is something truly amazing and worthwhile experiencing. Once we covered almost all, at least something that I find as one of the main pros when it comes to working with this medium, let's talk about the downsides or the cons when it comes to colored pencils. If you're one of those people that likes to do things a bit faster and you're not quite patient when it comes to drawing, then you would find this medium a bit annoying, as colored pencils are a medium that you need a patience for, and they can be quite time consuming. So the whole process of creating something with colored pencils can be time consuming in a way that you will need hours, sometimes days, for it to be done. Comparing to different mediums, acrylics for example, based on the choice of brush, you can easily cover huge areas with color. But when it comes to colored pencils, the only thing you have is just the tip of the colored pencils, and that's all you have to use to cover areas, whether big or small. So depending on how impatient or patient you are, you will either find this medium very meditative, take your time and enjoy coloring things bit by building up values, or you will find this frustrating and not the greatest option when it comes to your medium choice. This really depends on a personal preference, as sometimes I'm impatient as well, and I find pastel a similar medium to this one. Just with pastels you can cover bigger surfaces, quicker than with colored pencils. So sometimes when I'm in that mode, I tend to use more pastels than colored pencils, as sometimes I have the patience. I find the medium meditative and relaxing, but sometimes I like to finish my drawing a bit quicker, and then I tend to use pastels or markers, for example. Another frustrating thing that most of the artists find when it comes to colored pencils is the fact that sometimes they can be fragile. Now, this depends on loads of factors. For example, if you order them online, you won't have the control over how the package is going to arrive, for example. Maybe they will throw it away during the transport a bit harder than expected, and you might end up with a couple of lids already broken, which means that once you start sharpening them, the lid inside will already be broken and it will continue breaking. So this is something none of us has control over, and this is always a risk. So lid breaking is something that you might find quite frustrating. I, for example, never had that issue. I guess I was lucky enough not to run into broken lid pencils, but I know quite a few people who did. So this is something that probably people would find frustrating if it happens. This can also happen if you press your pencil a bit harder than expected. The lid can also break, which again, people find this not helpful, of course. So the important thing to know is that this can happen, which is definitely one of the cons. One of the cons as well is definitely the fact that this medium doesn't forgive mistakes or corrections. Once you layer the colored pencils and burnish it, especially wax-based colored pencils, that stays there. No erasing, no going over it. So in case you change your mind when it comes to the shapes or the forms, you will find it harder to correct it for sure. So you kind of have to have a plan when it comes to your drawing and know in advance your techniques if you want your drawing to work out. As when it comes to like acrylics, for example, gouache, even pastels, graphite pencils or charcoal, all of these mediums can be corrected if needed. But this is not the case with colored pencils, unfortunately. So keep this in mind if you decide working with colored pencils, as you have to be careful not making too many mistakes during the process of creating something. Now, these are pretty much things that you need to consider when it comes to colored pencils. Of course, every medium has its own ups and downs and its own advantages and disadvantages, so you will need to be ready for all the good and the bad things that you might find useful or frustrating whilst working with a certain medium. This is particularly for colored pencils, so take under consideration all mentioned stuff. Compare it, which of the cons might be a deal breaker for you, or this is something that you can completely work with regardless. I find all the cons something that is pretty much completely normal and that follows pretty much every medium. So personally for me, this is not a deal breaker, and I find colored pencils an amazing medium to work with, exciting, challenging, and wonderful. So I would highly recommend you to try it out, test your patience and your boundaries, and experiment with colored pencils as much as possible. This would be all for today's video. Truly hope you'll find this helpful, and I see you in another video, guys. Bye. It's hard to be a YouTuber. Bloopers. You definitely need to... Before they were pretty much being used for just making marking. I made a mistake. Another frustrating thing that most of the artists find when it comes to colored pencils is the fact that sometimes they can be fragile. Fragile. So keep this in mind if you decide working with colored pencils, and as you... This is particularly for... This would be all for today's video. Truly hope you find this helpful. This would be... I'm all red in the face.